Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to be talking again about the Middle Eastern conflict, Israelis versus the terrorist group Hamas. And we're going to talk about it because, again, we need to remind people that there are clear moral distinctions here. This is not relativism. This is not a situation where you have two sides of equal moral weight and you're trying to figure out which is the greater of the two. It's not even close. This is so clearly a moral Israeli victory as far as what they're undertaking, and it is a defeat of the Hamas side because Hamas is a terrorist group that is immoral and breaks laws, does everything outside of any kind of moral argument. So it's really an odd thing to see the world chasing after a terrorist group and defending a terrorist group. And it's actually very disturbing to see people in our very own nation, our very own elected representatives, some of the very own representatives in Washington, D.C., actually taking the side of the terrorist Hamas against Israel. So I found an article by Nolan Finley. He is a writer for the Detroit News, and he makes a lot of sense in this article. So I'm going to read the article and interact with it. And it's just more or less common sense. I don't know if he is a Christian believer. I don't know if he's a Jew. I don't know if he's a Christian. I don't know if he's an atheist. I don't know if he's an agnostic. But whatever he is, he simply is stating something that should be obvious to everyone, but it looks like it has to be stated anyway because we live in an irrational time. We live in an insane, foolish time. And so I just want to go over what his article states because it says it succinctly, it says it simply, and we need to listen to people like Nolan Finley who are laying this out very clearly. And whatever sympathies you have, whether you sympathize with the Palestinians overall in their cause or with the Jews in Israel overall in their cause, can we all agree that the terrorist act needs to be stopped and we need to bring justice to Israel? Can we all agree on that? And I think this article agrees with the basic moral principles of Christianity, and I'll explain why. It says, with Israeli tanks and troops moving into Gaza, the violence and bloodshed of the past 3 weeks will intensify along with the suffering of innocent civilians. So he mentions innocent civilians. He's speaking of those citizens of Gaza who are not on one side or the other. They're not necessarily pro-Hamas. They're not pro-Israel. They're just people. They're just citizens. They're trying to make a living. They go to work every day in the morning. They come home. They try to make a living and try to feed their families and try to get on with life. Those are the innocent civilians. And I've raised questions about, well, what percentage of the population of Gaza, the 2 million or so people in the Gaza Strip area, what percentage of them are really innocent bystanders and civilians? Because we know that there are those, but we just don't know what the percentage is. We shouldn't assume that all of the Gaza citizens are innocent civilians unless they have a rifle, because, of course, you can be pro-Hamas and you can celebrate the massacre of Jews in Israel and you can aid and abet the Hamas terrorists, and that would not make you an innocent civilian if you did those things. So what are the percentages? It's a little murky, but he's right here. There are going to be sufferings by innocent civilians as the Israeli army tries to root out the terrorist Hamas. Now, while Israel has pledged to follow the rules of war, whatever that means, okay, Well, he's a little skeptical here in his article about whatever that means. There are very clear rules of war as far as you should not target civilians. You should not target civilians. You should do whatever you can within reason to avoid civilian casualties while you are fighting a just war. That's what that means. So this is not, the rules of war are not all that fuzzy and relativistic. There are some very clear principles, and I think it would help if he would acknowledge that. But he's saying, well, whatever the rules of war are, Israel has pledged to follow them and protect civilians as much as possible. That's one of the rules of war. In fact, the fact that Hamas has embedded its fighters and weaponry within the civilian population of Gaza makes death and destruction inevitable. So here's an example of the Israeli army is following or trying to follow, within reason, the rules of war. Hamas, the terrorist group, is deliberately violating the rules of war. And so there's a very clear moral distinction between Israel, who are trying to follow the rules of war and not fire upon civilians and not hurt civilians within reason, and Hamas, who is following none of that and is actually targeting civilians in their weapons. So there's no moral equivalency here, the Israeli army versus Hamas army. Israel is clearly in the moral superior position. Hamas is the inferior moral position. They're not even trying to follow the rules of war. They're not even trying to follow them and doing it badly. They are not even trying to follow them. In fact, they're doing the very opposite. They are directly disobeying willfully the rules of war as far as civilians are concerned. Both sides will suffer. That's right. The massacre that killed innocent women and children and men in their homes, the slaughter, that was terrible, but it's also bad that the innocent civilians, the ones who are neutral and are bystanders in Gaza, probably will be hurt and killed also, and even maybe in greater number than even the Israeli civilians were hurt and killed. Both sides will mourn the losses of loved ones. Both sides will watch their homes reduced to rubble and their neighborhoods ripped apart. Both sides will endure heartbreak and spend their days in constant fear. That's true. There will be a lot of suffering, and that is what is the tragedy of war. And that is why war has to be avoided as much as possible, but not in an absolute sense. Because if you say we will never go to war, then you are basically locking your people into suffering. So if Israel were to say, okay, we will not go to war against Hamas, we are against war, then Israel will be attacked over and over again and ultimately overrun. So war has come upon Israel. They didn't ask for it, and they are simply defending themselves from people who will do that again and again and again and again. And everyone can see this, but yet we have protesters who refuse to acknowledge it. Our humanity demands we weep with those being harmed on both sides of Gaza-Israeli border, regardless of where our allegiances lie. The life of a Jewish child is no less precious than that of a Muslim child. That's true. Why? Because the Bible says that we are created in the image of God. And there is no distinction between one ethnicity and another ethnicity in the image of God. There are different races, there are different people groups all over the globe, and they're all made in the image of God. So yes, every child is precious in the sight of God. Every Jewish child, every Muslim child, every Christian child, every child is precious in his sight. But he goes on and says, but only one side provoked this misery with a vicious sneak attack by terrorists who slaughtered babies, raped women, burned people alive in a modern-day reprise of the Holocaust. Now, this is where a lot of people will try to dismiss this. Israel was minding its own business in its land. Again, as a Christian, we all have to agree that the Jews have a right to that land. That is the promised land. That is the land that God promised them. And we're going back thousands and thousands of years. And there is no greater, stronger claim on a land. I cannot think of a greater, stronger claim on a land of any people anywhere on the earth than the Jews have here. They have a written document, the Old Testament of the Bible, that shows very clearly that the deity, God Almighty, gave them that land. And he cleared out the sinful Canaanites because they had become exceedingly wicked, and it says that their wickedness had reached a level that God himself could not tolerate. And so he removed them from the land. He gave that land to the Jews in the conquest by Joshua. And that land has been Jewish land as far as God is concerned ever since. And as far as Christians concerned, it should also be considered Jewish land. It's only one little tract of land on the entire planet. And after World War II, the victorious allies, powers in Europe, established a homeland for the Jews because they were scattered about, and 5, 6, 7, 8 million of them had been slaughtered by Hitler's anti-Semitism in Germany and in Eastern Europe. And so they ceded that land over to the Jews. They didn't give it to them in the ultimate sense because God had already given them that land. And there had been a Jewish presence for thousands and thousands of years in the land. But they became an official nation for the first time in some 2,000 years. It said, only one side provoked this misery with a vicious sneak attack. So the Hamas terrorists decided to pick a fight with the Jews on their own land, the Jews' own land. And now the Palestinian terrorists, the Hamas terrorists, believe that the Jews should be wiped off the face of the earth. And that hatred has motivated them to refuse peace accords every time there has been a meeting for that end. Every single time a settlement has been proposed, and that Israel has even agreed to, in giving Palestinians tracts of land all over that area, the Palestinians have refused. Why? Because they don't believe Israel should have any bit of that land. So you can't negotiate with someone who doesn't believe that the other side deserves anything, and they want everything. They want the Jews to be wiped off the face of the earth. That's in their charter, Hamas. Only one side cheered those murderous fiends and celebrated their heinous deeds as a great victory, while declaring their victims deserved to suffer and die to atone for their sins. The only side that did that was the terrorist side, that cheered those murderous fiends. And there were many people in Gaza City. There were many Palestinians and Arabs around the world that celebrated the mayhem and murder and butchery and torture of innocent civilian Jews in Israel. It was only one side, though, and that was the terrorists. Rescuers pull a child out of a rubble of a building hit in an Israeli airstrike in Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip on October 24, 2023. Thousands of civilians, both Palestinians and Israelis, have died since October 7, 2023, after Palestinian Hamas militants based in the Gaza Strip entered southern Israel in an unprecedented attack, triggering a war declared by Israel on Hamas with retaliatory bombings on Gaza. So the terrorist attack triggered the retaliatory bombings of northern Gaza. What is the goal of the retaliatory bombings? To wipe out Hamas, the terrorist group, because they cannot be trusted to exist in the Middle East, because you never know when they're going to slaughter innocent civilians. You never know when they're going to break through the fence and begin butchering babies. They have no morals. They only have blind hatred to Jews, and they will only rest when the Jewish people and the Jewish state has been wiped out totally. Only one side kidnapped and is holding in dangerous conditions 245 hostages, many of them young children and the elderly, including in their number at least 17 American citizens. Yeah, only one side. There's no moral equivalency here. Only one side kidnapped over 200 hostages. Only one side declared murderous fiends and celebrated their heinous deeds as a great victory. Yeah, just one side. Only one side provoked this misery with a vicious sneak attack. So this whole thing started on the side of Hamas. They decided to kill Jews in Israel and slaughter them. Only one side prays for those hostages while the other side tears their photographs off the walls. So decent people, Christian people, and Jewish people, I presume, although it's weird because there are some Jewish people who are actually siding with the Palestinian and Arab nations, saying that these were all justified slaughters and it's payback and all of this. Only one side is praying for the hostages while the other side tears their photographs off the wall. There are students who say that the attack in Israel, the slaughter, the burning of babies and killing families in front of children, that was justified, they say. There are students at colleges in this university, Harvard University, and other leading institutions in this country. They're celebrating, they are celebrating, but they're saying it's justified because of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, which is totally, totally false. Only one side is preventing its people from fleeing to safety. That's right. The Palestinian authorities in Gaza Strip and Hamas, which pretty much are the same thing, Palestinian authorities, Hamas controls the Palestinian authorities. Only one side is preventing its people from fleeing to safety. Why don't they let people go anywhere? Get out of there. They won't. They want to use the people as human shields. Only one side has fired its relentless stream of rockets at its neighbor over the last 20 years, striking random targets. That's the Palestinian terrorist goal, striking random targets and killing innocent civilians while forcing the population to live under a constant death threat. Only one side has refused to accept the geopolitical reality of the past 75 years and chooses instead to live in a fantasy world in which its neighbors will someday tire of the constant torment, pack up, and let them have the whole neighborhood to themselves. So he's referring to Hamas's insane, absurd idea that the Jewish people are just going to get tired of getting attacked and slaughtered and killed through these terrorist acts, and they're just going to leave because you can force them out by treating them bad. And that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen because the Jewish people realize that God gave them that land. Even the secular people who don't even follow God or obey God or pay attention to the Bible, they don't practice their faith. They don't go to their synagogues and read from the scriptures. Even the secular Jews in Israel believe that it's established that the Jews own that plot of land. And I think even secular authorities that don't even believe in the Bible have to say, well, if you want to trace the history of that land, the Jews have had a claim on that land for 4,000 years. That's a long time. And it's a very unique situation. There aren't very many places on this earth that you can say one people has been linked to a certain portion of the land like the Jews. There are a few. You can look at the Egyptians and you can look at some of the other locations, but going back in history, well-documented credentials, the Jews definitely qualify there. But as Christians, we know that God gave them that land. So they're not going to leave and go where? They have been persecuted for century after century. They almost got totally wiped out with Hitler's Holocaust. They were given a portion of the promised land that the Bible gives them, and they took it. And now the Arab nations around them want that ended, and they want Jews out of that little part. So it's really unreasonable that the Arab nations cannot just accept the fact that the Jews, all they want to do is just exist there. They want to live in peace with the Arab nations around them, but the Arab nations around them have no interest in living at peace with them. It says, only one side has tried repeatedly to drive its neighbors into the sea, and that would be the Arab terrorists. Only one side has placed its fate into the hands of terrorist outfit willing to sacrifice its own people to advance its political goals, a group that has become the puppet of the world's most dangerous regime. Yeah, so this is reference here to the fact that Hamas is using the 2 million people in the Gaza Strip as puppets to use in whatever way they want to achieve the political goals they want. They will put them in front of the bullets and the bombs. They will tell the people to not go to the southern part of Gaza Strip so that the Israelis will have to bomb civilians in the northern part as they begin their incursion into Gaza to root out the terrorists. They are doing everything they can to make it hardest on the citizens of Gaza. They don't care about the citizens of Gaza. They don't care about the Israel people. They only care about their blind hatred toward the Jews. Only one side has chosen terror over diplomacy, pursuing a goal of wiping its neighbors off the map instead of accepting a treaty that would have lifted its people out of the misery in exchange for recognizing the right of that neighbor to exist securely in its own land. That's reference to the fact that every single peace proposal put on the table by the Western powers over the last few decades has totally been rejected by the Palestinians and those who are speaking for them. Only one side nourishes their children to a diet of hate, training them to see those on the other side as less than human, and thus enabling them to commit inhuman atrocities witnessed on October 7th. And this gets to the citizens in Gaza, too. The citizens in Gaza are being trained to hate Jews by the Hamas terrorists, and the children are learning to hate Jews from the Hamas terrorists. And so you have a whole toxic brew culture in the Gaza Strip where children are being inculcated into this hate and recruited by the terrorists to go into Israel. And there were many civilians in Gaza who actually broke through the fences too and went into Israel and plundered the Jews after they had been slaughtered by Hamas soldiers. So the whole atmosphere has to be changed, and that's why Israel is going in, and it's totally morally justified. And how anyone can make a moral equivalency between Hamas and the Israelites, or how anyone can make an equivalency to the Palestinian cause and the Israelites is just absurd. There is no moral equivalency. Only one side could end the violence immediately by renouncing terror. pointing out the terrorists and leading the rescuers to the hostages, and then committing to a sincere peace process. And you're not going to get that from the Hamas terrorists. These people are fanatics. They're hate-filled, demon-possessed, probably many of them. And they will not surrender. They will not release the terrorists of their own. And they will not lead the rescuers to the hostages. It will be upon the people of the Gaza Strip to rise up and begin to organize in a different way other than Hamas. It will be the people that will have to snitch on Hamas, rat out Hamas for the good of their own city. It'll have to be the Palestinians themselves that betray Hamas because Hamas has betrayed them. But to have college students and protesters siding with the Palestinian Hamas terrorists and saying that their moral cause justifies the slaughter of Israeli Jews is just absurd. And it's very disappointing to see in our very own country, in the Western civilization, in London, in Europe, you have a once great Judeo-Christian civilization now collapsing into this moral relativism where its citizens don't even know how to process moral decisions. I mean, the decision of Israel to go in and hunt for the Hamas terrorists is a no-brainer. It's not something that is difficult. It's not really that hard. And it's not even difficult to process the fact that there will be civilian casualties in the war, because when you're waging a war, there are always civilian casualties. But you can't stop waging the war against evil because there will be civilian casualties. If you do, then evil wins and Hamas wins. So it's very easy. But see, in the West, we've lost our ability to think morally, and we don't have absolute moral categories that we once had to be able to process these ideas. And so it's all emotion and it's opinion, and the mainstream media shows these video clips of bombed out buildings and children crying and women wailing and screaming and raising their hands, all emotional. It's all emotional, based on just feelings and raw emotions. And that's not the way you process moral decisions. You have to be clear thinking, and you have to keep your head about you. And so only one side has it in its hands, the barrels of blood being shed this week. And that side is not Israel. That's his article, and it's absolutely true. It is totally on the Palestinian Hamas terrorists' hands. This is on them. They cannot blame Israel for going into Gaza City. They cannot blame Israel for the civilian deaths that occur, because they can stop those civilian deaths by simply surrendering and receiving their justice, but they won't. And so I hope that this clarifies things for some people. There shouldn't be a lot of confusion because this is a fairly clear-cut case of Israel is in the right and they deserve to revenge and put to justice the crime against their nation that happened a couple weeks ago. Talk to you next week. God bless.